Today, we have the immense pleasure of having Professor László Barabási with us. So Professor László Barabási is the Robert Gray Dodge Professor of Network Science at the Network Science Institute of Northeastern University in Boston. Apart from this, he also holds an appointment in the Department of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And a bit closer to us, he runs an ERC project on the boundary between network science and graph theory at Central European University in the Budapest campus. I was thinking about this, and it's actually quite difficult to briefly introduce László, since he has contributed so much to our understanding of the role of networks in the structure and dynamics of complex systems in nature and society. He's, for a start, one of the founders of network science as a modern discipline in the early 2000s, with significant contributions such as the discovery of scale-free networks and the notion of burstiness in human communications. Among many other things, he works in many topics, particularly in brain structure, network medicine, and in the emergence of success in art and science, which is the topic that he will be talking about to us today. So in short, László, we are very, very happy to have you here. Thanks again for saying yes. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And I appreciate for the opportunity of being here. And indeed, I did decide actually a little bit to alter my talk in the last minute, as we all do, right? Which means there will be less art and more science. And there will be some more recent work, something that we actually submitted that I think is just exciting as some of the older work. And since I'm not showing science, I changed my background to show actually for those of you who by chance are calling from Germany, the CIVICA I'm exhibiting Karlsruhe of the lab's visualizations and artworks. So if you do happen to be in Germany or you want to travel around, the exhibit is still until March 3rd. And I think I can safely say that it will be an experience. So that would be the art piece for today. And so let's talk about science and quantifying careers in science, because I'm sure most of you are scientists and you care about how do you do that, right? And let's just start out by saying that, as we kind of clarified earlier, that I'm a network scientist, which means that I have spent the last 25 years focusing on various large complex networks, like originally the World Wide Web, the internet, like the internet map that we see here. But in the last few years, my lab has been very deeply involved in trying to understand the molecular networks within our cells. That is, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. What I meant by that is that how the molecules and the proteins in the cells are connected and how they lead to different types of human diseases. But as we kind of explore these type of systems, one of the questions that always kind of came to us is to say, well, listen, particularly when it comes to social systems, network science and computational social science has offered us the tools to restart quantifying the networks we're embedded in. And to a high degree, these networks determine our professional career, our success, our personal career, and so on. So could we actually use our knowledge and understanding of networks and big data to try to quantify how does science emerge both in science, or how does success emerge both in science as well as outside of science? And this was a journey that I started with Dashun Wang, who was a student in my lab at that time. And now it's been carried on by many members, former and current members of my lab. But when we actually got to this problem, we realized that if we want to talk about careers and success, that is not a purely network problem. That is, we have to first kind of identify what do we mean by success? How do we quantify that? And that's when we realized that we actually have to go ahead and distinguish two notions that are often mixed together in both in the literature as well as in our day-to-day conversations, which is performance and success. Well, what are they? Well, the way I think about it is performance is something that you do. That is how fast you run, how many papers you write, what is the content of those papers that you write, and so on. But success and recognition, however, is not as much about your performance, but about the reflection of your performance in the community. That is, to what degree do people realize your performance? To what degree they actually acknowledge it? And to what degree they reward for you for it? In other terms, one way to think about it is that performance is about you, but your success is about us, about all of us. And that is a key distinction because, I come from statistical physics, and as we see, performance is something that is very hard to measure. But because success is a collective quantity, it is much more amenable to quantification and to study. And that's really where some of the tools that we developed in network science come really handy. Now, how do we think about this and how do we put these two pieces together? How do we separate it? And one way to do that is to look at some areas where performance is very accurately quantified. And I'm realizing that I'm actually going to use now an example that has gone a little out of fashion lately with Novak Djokovic's behavior about vaccines. But despite of his craziness and nonsense approach to vaccines, let's just call it on the name, right? Because it's totally nonsense, his take on that. He has been and is actually one of the most prominent tennis players. And the question is really, how do we quantify his prominence? And there are many ways we can actually talk about Djokovic's visibility or success or performance. Is to talk about Google searches, is to talk about rankings, score points, wins and losses, Wikipedia visits, and how much money did he make, and so on. But what is interesting is that when we look at all of these things that we use conversationally to talk about Djokovic and his achievements, we're really mixing performance and success characteristics in a smooth way. And in reality, we need to distinguish them. And by distinguishing that what you see on the left-hand side, wins and losses, and score points and rankings and the winnings are all rooted purely in his performance. That is, how well does he play on the court? However, what you see on the right-hand side are success measures, Google search, Wikipedia visits, and endorsements, because while they are, of course, driven by his performance, it's not something that he does, but we do to him, right? We Google him, we go to his Wikipedia page, and through these processes, actually, we drive his endorsements. So the question we asked originally several years ago to say, could we actually take performance measures like in tennis, which are kind of clearly available, and predict the success measures that characterize him or other tennis players? And to see how we did that, let's look at the Wikipedia views, that how many people are looking at a given week on his Wikipedia page. And what you can see that there's quite a bit of variability from one week to the other one. And also the Wikipedia visibility pretty much kind of follows his trajectory, not much till 2010, when he finally started to win major tournaments. And then after that, there are these major peaks, interest and loss of interest, mainly driven obviously by the games he plays and whether he wins or loses. So the question is, could we use only performance measures to predict this curve? Well, in order to do so, we ended up writing a formula, something like that. What is special about this formula, that is what you see on the right-hand side, is everything is a performance measure only. That is, where did he play? Whom did he play against? Did he win or lose? What was the prestige level of the tournament? How far did he get in the tournament, and so on? If you're interested in the paper, we have all the parameters. But what you can trust me that on the right-hand side, everything that you see is performance driven. On the left-hand side, however, is a success measure or collective measure, which is about us. Whether are we going to visit or not his web page or his Wikipedia page. And it turns out it works pretty well. Look at that. The red is actually what the formula predicts. And you can see that it rather accurately tracks the temporal patterns and to some degree up the multiplicative constant, also the magnitude of the variations. And why does this formula work well? Well, because when it comes to areas like sports, performance does drive success. And this is, of course, good news for all of us, because this is what we're taught always in the school, to say you got to practice, you got to exercise, you got to study, because that gives you performance, and eventually performance will lead to success. And in a way, we're quantifying that particular statement in case of tennis. But tennis, however, and so let's kind of go ahead and summarize this as statements. And what we see in tennis is performance drives success. But let's dig deeper into this performance and the success piece. And I'm going to make actually a statement that looks contradictory first, but I will hopefully unpack it. I'll claim that performance is bounded and success is unbounded. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's look deeper into performance. What you see here is the fastest man on earth, right? Usain Bolt, as winner of countless sprint competitions, Olympics, and so on. And what is interesting about, if you look at his performance, which is how fast that he runs, it turns out that while he's the fastest, his performance is only slightly better than the one who actually loses the race. Actually, the difference between the winner and the loser in the Olympics is typically 1% in speed. And he may be the fastest man on earth, but he's not running more than 10 times faster or 100 times faster than I run. And trust me, I'm not a great runner. I'm not a runner at all, right? So in a way, while he's the best, he's not a huge outlier when it comes to measurable characteristics. And if we actually look in the performance characteristics of runners or any other area that we can actually quantify, it turns out that performance always follows what we call an exponential distribution, which, as you know, is a bounded distribution, which means that most people have comparable performance. And then, of course, there are some who run faster than the others or do better than the others, but they do so only marginally and not significantly. And this has consequences. Because let's think about it. What would happen if you are not able to measure so accurately performance? And let me give one more example in sports to bring that message home. So this is the Rio Olympics, which is now history. But there's something interesting happened, which is three swimmers, Phelps, the American, Lacrosse, and Czech, the Hungarian swimmer. They all actually had a three-way tie, and they all got the bronze medal. And the question would be, why did they have a tie? And in an odd way, it's not because they didn't know who arrived first. Of course, there was video recordings and they knew exactly who was the first to arrive. However, the time difference between their arrival was less than the time it takes to swim 2.5 centimeters, which is the tolerance of the swimming pool. That is, we only know up to that precision the size of the swimming pool. So now think about it. If in an area where we have hundreds of cameras and video recordings, we are not able to decide who is the best swimmer, right? How do we decide who is the best scientist, who is the best doctor, who is the best teacher, who is the best painter? And what is happening every time we look at performance is that because performance is bounded, it's not that there are people, some are not better than the others, but the differences are at the top are so tiny that they are virtually unmeasurable. And most of us work in areas where we do not have cameras watching our performance. So most of us actually have to realize that it's virtually impossible to say, am I a better scientist than any of my colleagues, including those who just started graduate school, right? So given that, what I'm trying to say here is that performance is bounded. And that's a very humbling proposition, because it says there's no objective way to say that we're better than anybody else who is also good at what he does. This is not to say that there is no difference between good performance and bad performance. All I'm saying is that no matter of what performance area you look at, from science to sports, you will find that there will be a few individuals who are all good and they're virtually or practically indistinguishable. But let's talk about success. Success, as I said, is a collective measure, captures what does the community think about your performance. And there are many ways you can measure success, from citations to sales to visibility and so on. So I'm going to give one example that is personal to me, which is in 2009, when my second general audience book, Burst, came out. I was, of course, in New York and very curious, together with my publisher, who is the competition. Everybody wants to be on the bestseller list, in the general audience book, and you wanted to see who is there. And who was there? Well, that was the week that Dan Brown came out with The Lost Symbol and Nicholas Sparks with The Last Song, and they were number 1 and 2 on the bestseller list. Somewhat tough competition indeed. Now, what is interesting, however, about the number 1 and 2 is that when you look at the bestseller list of the top 25 books selling, you would say, well, if Nicholas Sparks' team works a little better, you should unthrone Dan Brown, because at the end, Sparks works much better than Brown, and so on and so forth. So then the question is, how much harder do they have to work to really become number 1? So for that, we ended up looking at the sales patterns of Nicholas Sparks' books. And what you saw is that on the week when the book was published, which is over here, it sold over 100,000 copies, which is huge, right? In the sense that you actually can end up on the bestseller list with selling 3,000 copies per week in the US market. And you're easily number 1 when you sell 10,000. Yet Nicholas Sparks sold more than 100,000 and he was not number 1. Why wasn't he number 1? Because there was Dan Brown, who in the same weekend sold 1.2 million copies. And what this huge difference between number 1 and 2 indicates is, first of all, this huge contrast with what we saw in performance, right? Where it is indistinguishable number 1 and number 2. But it indicates that when it comes to success, the differences can be giant. And that is because whenever we measure success, whether it's book sales, whether it's citations, whether it's visibility, Wikipedia visits, or so on, it always follows a power law distribution. And the power law is an unbounded distribution, meaning that there are a couple of outliers who can be orders of magnitude bigger than the next one in line, and clearly orders of magnitude bigger than the average. So that kind of leads to this key conclusion of this part of the lecture, that we saw that performance drives success, but in many cases, performance is very, very hard to measure. And most important, performance and success are mathematically very, very different quantities. Performance being an individual measure is typically bounded, follows exponential distributions. Success being a collective measure, it's typically unbounded, following different versions of power laws. Now, you may ask, how is it possible that from these indistinguishable bounded distributions that drive success, right, you get these unbounded distributions? Well, that would be a whole different lecture, how to connect the two of them together. But I'm sure you have seen many papers, including the tools of preferential attachment and so on, to explain how those power laws could emerge from tiny differences at the beginning. What I'm going to do now is that instead of going in that direction, is to go back to science and to the career of scientists and say, how do these ideas apply there? In order to do so, let's start with the career in science that I'm most familiar with, which is my own career. What you see over here is a little outdated. We should have kind of updated a little bit, but is the citations that each of my papers that published during my career have accumulated in the first 10 years after publication. And the reason we do that is because if we don't cap it at 10 years, then obviously the older papers will look more important than the more recent ones, right? So that's a normalizing measure. And when you look at my career, started in '89, my first paper that I published when I was an undergraduate in Bucharest, Romania, all the way till today, you see kind of very different patterns. You see the first 10 years of career where I published a lot that no one seemed to have noticed, right? And that is that stage of my career, and really truly took about 10 years. So if you feel you are there, don't worry, there's better days to come, right? But you have to work for it. And then about 10 years into my career, something has changed. And what has changed is, it's in the hindsight, is obvious. I switched fields from statistical mechanics of materials and surfaces, and I started exploring networks. And Then what happened in the next 5-10 years is that we had one high impact paper after the other one. And that really felt good. And that was really that stage of my career. And it felt like it could never go down. But then, of course, comes the later stage of our career that I don't know what's happening here, right? Because there hasn't enough time passed for some of these papers to really achieve the number of citations they would. So not 10 years have passed. But the real question is that, have I perhaps reached another stage of my career in something like that, right? So is there still hope for me as a scientist in my mid-50s, or I am practically scientifically dead? And that's the question that really I was curious about, or we were curious about, but particularly me, right? And for that, we ended up kind of asking the question, when does a scientist like myself or anyone else publish their highest impact paper? And of course, age is difficult to collect because we don't know the age for all scientists, but we actually define age as academic age, which is how many years have passed since the first publication that you ever had. And it turns out that technically my highest impact paper came 13 years into my career, and it was the 63rd publication in my career, right? So the question was, now, if you look at my career, you could say, hey, before that happened, you could see that there were papers kind of getting more and more impact. So you could actually see success coming, right? And then once I figured that out, I was able to occasionally reproduce it. And you don't have to reproduce it with every single paper because there are many papers we publish that are just cleaning up the subject, right? So we don't expect every paper to be high impact, but that we were able to somehow reproduce it over and over. So then the question we asked, could we actually really see in a scientist's career whether that particular peak year is coming? And for that, we ended up analyzing, in this case, all scientists, but I'm going to show you the data for physicists. And we asked, how does performance and productivity change as you are approaching your highest impact work? So obviously, we're looking at careers that closed already. Our definition of a closed career, that no publication for at least 5 years or ever after a certain moment for a career. And we have some criteria how you include somebody into that you have for 20 years at least, every 5 years at least one paper. And for each scientist, we ended up identifying the highest impact work he or she published, independent whether there was a paper that only got 15 citations or 20,000, right? What matters is that was that person's personal best. So we said, how does productivity change as you are approaching your personal best? So we're moving T-star is when you reach your personal best. And what was interesting is that when we look at the productivity, particularly the high productivity individuals, you see a clear growing trend as you are approaching that magical moment. And then there is actually a saturation. And that curve is very reminiscent of what psychologists learn as the learning curve, or the learning pattern of like this. If you learn piano or violin, you are improving, and then at a certain moment, you actually reach a peak performance, which you then maintain for the rest of your life, with slow decrease after 10, 20 years, right? And that's what we see. So when it comes to performance, productivity does improve as you are approaching your largest hit. Well, how about success? So success is measured in terms of the citations. So we said, how many citations do the papers get preceding or after the highest impact work? And we were hoping to get a similar curve that it will increase as we're coming closer and closer. To our surprise, the data did not show that. Rather, the curve looked like that, which we actually have a name for it. We call it the finger curve, because what it actually shows is that you can see impact coming, and nor do we actually seem to learn from it, right? So while productivity is improving towards your highest impact paper, the impact of the papers is not showing that systematic pattern. So that was disappointing to some degree, but at least we had signal in one area. But the question we wanted to ask, when do you find that magical moment? When is that T-star emerging in your career? Is it early or late in the career? And when we started this research, there was lots of precedent in that space. And most important, there was lots of biases for example, Einstein himself made the claim that the person who has not made his great contribution to science before the age of 30 will never do so. So in general, there is a belief in the literature that is still everywhere across multiple literatures that if you want creative people equals young people, that only if you are young can be creative. And why did Einstein say that? Well, because he looked around himself and looked at the people that he admires, which were the kind of the golden age of quantum mechanics. And many people who actually made the key contributions were their kind of mid to late 20s or early 30s, right? So he had empirical data to support that. So based on this, of course, I have answered my question. Einstein said, there is no hope for me as a scientist to ever do anything more useful than I did in my early 30s in network science, right? But we don't give up so easily. So we ended up asking the question, if we look at not Nobel Prize winners, but ordinary scientists, that is all of us, right? When does this magic moment happen? Is it really early in the career that we published our highest impact work? So what is the distribution of this T star across all the careers? And for that, we ended up identifying for each scientist the publication history. So here I put a bunch of physicists from the first to last publication on the same scale. That's what you see over here. And there's a red dot in their citation curve if that was that physicist's personal best, that is his or her highest impact paper. And the rest of them, if you don't have a red dot, it means it was just a local peak on their career. And so we asked the question, how are these red dots distributed across the career? Are they biased towards early career or they are random? And to do so, we ended up first measuring the distribution of the PT star. And to some degree, when we looked at the curve, it reproduced Einstein's intuition and much of the literature out there, because it said that PT star seems to be peaked around 10 to 15 years at the beginning of the career, and it's relatively fast for the first 20 years, and then it drops significantly after that. So I'm kind of in year 30 of my career. So based on this data, the answer is very clear for me. My chances of publishing a paper that would in impact overcome my earlier papers is actually less than 1%. Well, but we are scientists and we know better now just to simply count beans. So we need to have a reference frame, because we need to ask, well, what would happen if people would publish their papers totally random? That is, if impact would be totally random in your career. And for that's easy to do, right? We just take every scientist's career that you see in the background over here, and we just randomly shuffle the impact of all their papers. So we keep the same number of papers, we keep the publication date, but we just shuffle within the same scientist's career the impact, right? So maybe your first paper was your highest impact, and now by chance the fifth paper becomes the highest impact. And we said, how does this reference curve look like if impact is purely random? And that's how it looks like, virtually indistinguishable from the original curve. And if you think deeper, it will take a few minutes to realize that when we randomize the impact, we're effectively measuring productivity. That we're measuring what's the likelihood that you would publish a paper in the first 10 or 20 years in your career. And so what we see is that the productivity curve is really indistinguishable from the timing of your highest impact curve paper, which has only one interpretation, that is, impact is purely random. That is totally random whether you see your first or your last paper that has actually the highest impact in your career. That is, you never know when your impact comes, right? So this story is not correct, right? The reason why impact vanishes later in the career is not because creativity vanishes, but because productivity goes away. Because we get sick, we become department chairs, we get other interests in our life, right? And we stop doing what we did before, which is publishing. But in the space of the publications, it's totally random whether your first or last paper will be the highest hit. And that's what I'm showing on the right-hand side, that the orange dot is the highest impact paper of these many scientists, and you see it's totally random from the ones to the last one. And there are famous examples to illustrate that. Frank Wilczek, who got the 2004 Nobel in Physics, he did so for the very, very first paper that he published in his career together with his advisor as a graduate student. But my favorite example is not him, but John Flynn, who actually got the Nobel Prize for a paper that he published after he was forcefully retired by Yale University. Not only they forcefully retired him, but they also closed his lab. Then he moved from Yale to Virginia Commonwealth University, and that's where he published after retirement the paper for which then 10 years later eventually got the Nobel Prize. And so he's a wonderful example that impact sees no age, right? Productivity has age. But if you're willing to stay with your trade and continue trying, you just never know when your impact could totally independent of age, which is of course very good news for me. But before I dwell too much on it, let me tell you a little bit one of the interesting conclusions that we got from that, right? And it turns out that the fact that impact is totally random in the career has quantitative consequences. We're able to build up a model that captures how career evolves in time. And in order to do so, we are measuring impact in terms of the citations within 10 years. And we ask the question, what are the different parameters, that individual characteristics that determine your impact? And obviously one of them is, productivity, right? How many papers you publish, so that's a key factor. And also to some degree luck, right? Is that each paper has a random impact, right? And you're pulling from a certain distribution. But we want to also acknowledge the fact that we are all different, and some people are better at recognizing what is interesting and turning into a paper than others. So we're going to call that the Q factor, which is a hidden parameter, and we'll be curious whether that is actually becomes measurable. And the hypothesis is that the way we scientists work, the simplest model you can build up is that we are picking papers from some random distribution. We could be picking ideas, which is this P, which is from some random distribution, which is the value of that idea, how interesting that idea that. And we take that idea and multiply it with our own Q factor that is unique to us. And the product of this random idea value and the Q factor becomes the citation of the paper, the impact of the paper. But because there are these three parameters, the distribution from which we're picking the random numbers, our Q factor, and of course the productivity, we would think that these are coupled, right? So if you have a high Q factor, if you know how science is being done, you may actually go ahead and be able to publish more and you pick better ideas. But when we analyze this model, we realize that many of these things actually are not coupled. And here's what I'm showing, the coupling between the different parameters, and the parameters are strictly zero in that case, which means that the idea pool from which everybody picks their ideas is totally decoupled from your Q factor, as well as from the productivity. That is, how many papers you published does not actually strongly affect whether you're picking better ideas. Right? Or nor does your Q factor seem to affect whether you're picking better ideas. So that's one of the key factors, right? So therefore, if they decouple, then it means that really we all have access to the same pool of ideas, but N and Q have a weak coupling to each other. That is, the more you publish, the higher the chance that you will make a major discovery. But what is interesting, and that's kind of the key, the most surprising discovery, is that we said, how does the Q factor evolve with your age or scientific age? And we would have thought, right, that the more experienced you are, the better you are at turning ideas into papers. And to our surprise, we learned that whether your Q factor is low or high or very high, or medium, very high, it's more or less constant throughout the career. That is, there's not a constant increase, but the Q factor seems to be something that is inherent to the scientist that is shaped very early in the career. And of course, we can only start measuring it once you start publishing. But before you start publishing, there are many years of education, right? So those education years uniquely define your Q factor and what you kind of pick up from that. And that more or less stays within our career. That was really unexpected to us, and of course, what we also learn when we analyze is that the Q factor is the best predictor of the Nobel Prize, and the citations are doing all right in the H factor, but much less predictive, and the worst predictor, of course, is productivity. Now, the last two topics that I would like to talk about is kind of in the interest of time is that, how do we assign credit for success? And traditionally, in all times, credit was easy to assign because Einstein published relativity. It was pretty clear whose credit it is. He was the only paper only author on the paper. So is for Darwin, right, to some degree. And there was always competition. Darwin had balance, and Einstein had Wallace, and Einstein had Lorentz, and so on. But nevertheless, the papers were single author papers. Today, we don't do that any longer. Science is really a team exercise and a team sport. And when we actually look at it, we have papers like that. And here I picked 3 papers that all got Nobel Prizes. And the question is, when you have so many authors in the paper, who gets the Nobel Prize? Would you be able to guess by looking at the paper and the credits of it to say which of these authors gets the credit for the work? Should it be the last author like that? Or should it be the first author like that? Or maybe the middle author like that? Right? Or maybe in some cases, could you actually pick who should get the Nobel Prize among these authors? And it's pretty obvious, right? Those are the ones who should be getting it. So the question is, how do we decide who gets the credit for a body of work that is out there? And but we do have a mechanism to do so, because at the end, prizes are given and the community has a pretty good understanding of that, of roughly where the credit goes. And the question is, could we somehow build an algorithm to measure that? In order to see that, let's just show how that actually works. So let's say a case study. Nobel Prize in Chemistry, Baba and Nagishi. This is the paper for which the prize was awarded, but only Baba got it. Well, Nagishi got it, I'm sorry. And when we look at who are the most co-cited papers with the Nagishi paper, with the Nobel Prize winning paper, it turns out that all had Nagishi as co-author, but never had Baba, right? And case study A, the Graphene Nobel Prize, or B, the Graphene Nobel Prize, where you had 2 co-authors actually, and all the co-cited papers, so that the most co-cited papers with the Nobel Prize winning always contain both of the co-authors, and they actually both got the Nobel Prize. So effectively, it looks like the community is looking how systematically the knowledge is connected to one or multiple authors. And we could actually look at the citation patterns and extract that. And we built an algorithm, which is really just a formula that says if there's a paper and that has 2 authors, who is citing that paper and what other papers by the same co-authors are being cited. And whether one or the other co-authors' papers are more cited than the other one. In this case, you see the red authors' papers are mostly co-cited, and there's only one green author paper co-cited. And therefore, the credit seems to be going mostly to the red authors. And at the end, we can actually, the formula that we have in this paper ends up giving us a precise ratio that the credit, 67% of the credit goes to red author and 33% to the green author. So we applied that one for this case, and what we see that indeed, the algorithm suggests that 72% of the credit goes to Nagishi and 28% to Baba. In the Nozzle-Offen game, the algorithm suggested half and half credit. Now, how do we know that we are right? Because these are just 2 case studies, right? So we ended up looking at all the Nobel Prize winning papers, and we said, how often does the algorithm get right that it actually predicts who among the co-authors of the paper gets the Nobel Prize? So each year you actually have how many co-authors the paper had, and we get the red dot if we got it right, that the algorithm predicted that these are the co-authors that got the Nobel Prize, and we get the black dot when we missed that somebody else gets the Nobel Prize, not the one the algorithm predicted. And you see, most of the time we get it right in physics and chemistry, but a few times we get it wrong. Those are the black dots. And it turns out that each of them is a very interesting story of its own whenever we get it wrong. And I'm going to tell you one case where we got it wrong, which is the 2008 Nobel Prize in Chemistry that went to Shimamura, Chalfie, and Tsien for something that certainly preserved the Nobel Prize. They were credited for the discovery and development of the green fluorescent protein, or GFP. Every time you look at the biological samples in biology papers and you see these green and yellow and red figures showing genes being turned on and off, that is based on this work, and that's what the Nobel Prize acknowledged. The odd was that our algorithm insisted that the prize should not go to the three of them, but rather should go to a gentleman that named Douglas Fraser. And the problem was that we couldn't find him anywhere. He doesn't seem to be an active researcher in any academic institution or nowhere else. He virtually disappeared. But he did actually work in that case. And so his story is very, very interesting. He was the one who first recognized that jellyfish is fluorescent and built up the hypothesis that maybe one gene may be responsible for that, one protein. And he was the one who cloned, as an assistant professor at Woodholz, the gene, the GFP gene. And he knew why he wanted to do that. Once he cloned the gene and published it, he wanted to turn that one into a lamp within the cells. He wanted to fuse the GFP protein with other proteins to do what biologists do with the GFP molecule today. So he wrote a proposal to get the funding to do their follow-up experiments. And NIH turned him down. And most of us get turned down by funding agencies every day, and we carry on. He got so disappointed that he left science. But before he left science, he said, I don't want my work to get wasted. So he ended up actually mailing 2 files with the gene that he identified, the GFP, to Roger Tsien and Martin Chalfie. And they did what he couldn't do. He turned them actually into the lamp. And Roger Tsien actually put him as a co-author, Chalfie didn't. But the algorithm correctly identified that the idea really and the core discovery came from Fraser. And in the moment the Nobel Prize was announced, Roger Tsien came out publicly that in his mind, the Nobel Prize committee has made a mistake and it should be Douglas Fraser actually who should get the Nobel Prize. What happened to Fraser? After he left science, he became an applied scientist in a non-academic lab for which he lost his job. And at the moment I was searching for him, he was actually driving a cab, or effectively a courtesy event at the car dealership. So he's actually a good example or an important kind of case that really how important are networks, and even in this case, professional networks when it comes to awarding the prize. He clearly in the scientist's mind deserved the prize. The key contributors knew that, but he was not anymore present in the network, right? So no one was recommending him. And what I would like to do in the last few minutes, and we'll come back a little bit because this is of course connected deeply to the claim that performance is not enough to actually get success. Success or recognition is a collective measure. And Douglas Fraser is one of those cases that he clearly had the performance to get the Nobel Prize. And he did not have actually the collective acknowledgements for his work. That acknowledgement went to 3 other scientists. Now, what I would like to finish with is to tell you some more recent work that I'm very excited about. We just submitted it, I think, 2 weeks ago, which is kind of goes back a little bit to citations and starts kind of force us to think about the fact that is citation a good measure of really scientific impact? And one kind of example that we can actually quote is that if you look at, and I should have probably brought here kind of the citation patterns of Einstein, and you will realize that Einstein is by no means actually a very, very highly cited scientist. And there are many network scientists who are better cited than Einstein's papers are. That is not to say that network science is more important than his work, but somehow we have actually learned to appreciate his work without citing it. But we use his work, and the physicists use his work all the day. They use relativity, they use aspects of quantum mechanics, they use many aspects of his work, but they do so without citing it. So that leads to the concept of what I call hidden citations, a work that Xianji Men and Onur Varol, who was a former lab member, did in my work, which is the idea that you actually have a discovery like the ABS-CFS, which is a big deal in high energy physics. And most of the cases, when somebody actually uses that theory, it cites the paper, which is reference 1 in this case, for that made that discovery. But there are many, many cases where the concept and the tools that are being used, they're verbally mentioned that they're using the EDS CFT theory, but they're not bothering to cite. And they're not bothering to cite because it's all the readers know what is being used. And in the same way, you don't need to any longer cite the 1905 paper by Einstein to talk about relativity. When you measure relativity in the scientist's mind, that's hardwires the word Einstein. So the referees will not call you out any longer to say you forgot to cite him, right? So we call hidden citations when there is an unambiguous allusion to a body of knowledge or a discovery or a particular paper without an explicit citation to the manuscript that introduced it. And with the emergence of NLPs and machine learning, as well as the increasing number of full text papers out, we went out to ask, could we identify these hidden citations? And we do so by developing a machine learning tool that reads the sentences and identifies the citations and identifies the keywords and learns the association between papers and keywords. And then it looks in papers where the citation is missing, but the keyword is there. And the algorithm actually goes and does like that. And I'm showing some examples, like in high energy physics, like ADS-CFT that I mentioned to you. There are a series of unique keywords that in the scientist's mind uniquely connect those keywords to the ADS-CFT theory. And in most papers, the funding papers are 2 papers that appeared in 1990 and 98. Most of the time I've cited, but in a few cases, there are many cases are not cited. So we ended up identifying all of these hidden citations. And here I'm showing you the citation patterns of these 2 papers, right? And these are the cases, the dark brown on the bottom are cases where the papers are cited without mentioning the keywords. It rarely ever happens that people are citing the paper without saying, I'm working on the EDS-CFT theory, right? This is the dumb brown part here at the very bottom, right? And the orange part is when they actually mention the keyword and they cite it. But the green part is the hidden citations, which is far more than actually the orange part, right? Which is they actually use the keywords, they're relying on the theory, but they don't bother to cite. And here I'm showing you actually an example of astrophysics, but we ended up identifying about 700 such papers that acquire hidden citations. And this is very, very prevalent. So here I'm showing you actually the foundation papers in physics, and the blue circle, the dark part of the circle always corresponds to the real citations, and the bigger circle is that how many hidden citations they got. And you see that virtually everybody has hidden citations out there. Not everyone actually, but most of them do. And it's very, very prevalent. And here this is shown by the co-citations, and that naturally groups the different fields. Now you may ask, what determines whether you will ever get hidden citations? Does your paper get it without you knowing it, right? And it turns out that it's not enough for the paper to be highly cited. Not all highly cited papers get hidden citations. The community has to give it a unique name. That is, has to be, somehow the community has to develop a shorthand for that paper. And that shorthand is often not determined by the authors themselves, right? It's not in the original paper, but rather given by the community. For example, if you look at the Barabási Albert paper that Breika and I published that has quite a number of hidden citations under scale-free networks and so on, we have not used the term scale-free network in the original paper. Yet scale-free network is being as a hidden term that people kind of connect the paper to our work, right? And it turns out that hidden citations also change the impact on the top, right? So what, for example, what we find in this case is that the most paper on the archive is a paper is actually the AZSF CFF theory that loses its top site for somebody who's #1 on normal citations, a phenomenology paper in inflation theory, because that paper was longer out and acquired many more hidden citations. So hidden citations really show us, and that's kind of the key conclusion, is that foundation ideas in science are not undercited. Well, I'm sorry, they are undercited without being underused, right? So we're using them on a daily basis, but the traditional citation measures are not capturing that. And we think this is very interesting from the perspective that we all rely on citations to quantify impact. And it's precisely the highest impact work is the one that is being hurt by the fact that we don't bother to cite it any longer, right? Because everybody knows what we mean. And this could be a moment for me to end this lecture and turn to questions. I think the key and the humbling message really that I took away from this research is performance is about you, but success is about us, right? So it's not you who drives your success, but it is us as a community, which also means that we have a responsibility as a community to really acknowledge what we think is important and also communicate it to other communities, because if we don't do it, no one else will do. And in general, we also find, and I haven't had a chance to talk about the art piece, where we see it even more clearly that in areas where performance is measurable, performance does drive success, and that's very detectable. But in areas where performance cannot be measured, then it is networks, often invisible and sometimes mappable networks that drive success. But that would be another lecture. And I'm happy to stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, László, for this extremely interesting talk. I really, really enjoyed it. We actually do have a few questions for you. They are in the chat. If you don't mind, I can paraphrase them maybe for you. Great. So the first one is actually related to the Q model that you were discussing. We have this Q factor, right? That seems to predict or give us like a sense of the personality of each, or you know, like of the of each one of the scientists. So, but probably this Q factor is a combination of many omitted factors or properties. So which ones do you think, or what is a guess of these properties that accumulate into the Q factor?
Well, this is a great question, and I wish I would know the answer, right? and the reason why it was so difficult for us to show is that it seems to be developing right away at the beginning of the career. So it's clearly driven by factors that precede your publication record. So that typically means schooling, where did you go to school, who were your mentors, and so on and so forth. And as good and as penetrating deep big data is becoming, that information is still not available in a systematic manner for scientists. Obviously, I can guess that education and where you go to school matters a lot, not because the school makes you better, and I've written extensively in my book about that, but because the better schools get better students, right? So there's a competition always by the ambitious scientists to get into the better schools to work with better mentors or what they perceive as better mentors. So there's a natural selection of better or more ambitious scientists ending up in the more prestigious schools. But I would suspect that as a proxy, where you went to school and who else came out from that is actually would serve as would be somewhat predictive. But we have not been able to go after that.
Thanks for that. There's another question actually from all of these data sets that you have been analyzing during several years in the distributions of citations and success of the scientists. Have you seen systematic differences between different fields of science?
Oh, yeah, there are giant differences. I mean, the most important, it was Santo Fortunato many years ago, published a very fundamental paper in PNAS, in which he showed that the distribution of the citations per field is exactly the same functional form. It's typically a log normal or power law, depending on how you want to fit it. But they are always shifted to each other, and they collapse into each other if you take the average and you collapse with the average, which means that there are fields like biology that is very, very highly cited, and the average citations is very large. And there are fields like mathematics where 5 citations is a giant, highly cited work, right? And what is interesting is that the pattern is universal. So mathematics, that's distribution of citations, follows the same as biology or physics. They're just shifted to each other. So that's one key difference, right? And where is that difference coming from? It's not only productivity of how many papers individuals publish, but it's even more based on the how many citations are per paper. That's kind of a key, and that seems to be a field-based norm, right? So in biology, we see 30, 40, 50 citations per paper, often limited by the publication venue that sets a maximum number. And in mathematics, it's very common to have 1 or 2 citations per paper. So there is no pressure to really kind of acknowledge previous work, or they do so in a very limited manner. That seems to be one of the biggest actually drivers of, for example, the citation differences. But there are also differences in terms of how we acknowledge co-authorship, right? And also how we rank the authors on this. So for example, mathematics and certain areas of engineering and computer science, alphabetical ordering is very, very common. In biology and increasingly in physics, it's the senior author last, junior lead author first, actually seems to be signaling where the kind of credit should go. So there are systematic differences, but and those are exciting to study, but there are also huge commonalities. And I think to really understand science, we need to look at both, right? Because you need to understand the common patterns to really understand whether a particular field stands out or not.
Great, thanks for that. Very interesting. There's another question, actually. I was thinking something in the same line. As you have been mentioning, true success is a very difficult thing to measure, right? And it seems that a big factor of it is this idea of attention, the attention that the rest of the community is giving to you. So the question is, do you think these two things can be separated? For example, in the case that there might be, a controversial or an incorrect paper that attracts a lot of attention and therefore gets many citations. So could we separate this somehow and really get success measures that are somehow more related to the inherent quality of a paper?
Well, that is a difficult one, and I don't think anybody has succeeded at that, to be honest. So at the end, all the available success measures are kind of rooted in things that are factor distribution, they are driven by popularity to some degree, right? And this is not to say that a highly cited paper is not important, but on the other hand, there are many papers who are not highly cited, and yet they are foundational to the field. To the credit of the scientific community, Nobel Prizes many times go to papers with a few hundred citations, right? So I don't think I think that the scientific community ultimately has developed methods to internally evaluate the impact of the paper and understand the role of the paper and acknowledge them accordingly. So for example, review articles get a huge number of citations, right? And often methods papers get a huge number of citations. But we as a community don't perceive that they will be at par with an original discovery that changes the field. And so at the end of the day, I'm not particularly concerned. I am concerned to the degree that if people start looking only at the citations and the derived measures to really rank people and give them credit for the work. But we do better than that normally. And the scientific community has balances and checks to really find a way to shine light on those that had contributions that are fundamental, yet they may not be the darlings of Wikipedia or of Google searches.
Perfect. Thanks for that. There was another very quick question, I guess, if we still have like a couple of minutes for it. So they're asking us, have you compared the estimated attribution, if your work does that, for the different authors to the specific attributions indicated in the publications themselves?
Wait a second. So what are we talking about? Can we clarify that? Because because the work that I presented on measuring the impact of the scientist, the relative impact, and that particular formula is really trying to capture, and it does a good job of saying, how does the community see the relative contributions of each individual in that particular discovery? So that's what is actually intended for. And it also can do, by the way, in the paper we discussed that you don't need to be co-author to measure the relative contributions. So if there's a discovery that was published by multiple papers in multiple co-authors, we are able to rank the authors of who in the people's mind actually has the biggest contribution. And for example, in the paper, we discussed the case of the Higgs boson, where Higgs got the Nobel Prize, and together with the second author whose name I don't remember, and our algorithm actually suggested that there should have been a third person who got more credit in the community's mind than the one who actually got together with Higgs. Higgs got the biggest credit, but the number 2 credit came to someone else who was still alive, right? And the one who actually got the prize, the second recipient of the prize was the third one. And the fact that we were right in our assessment was also shown by Higgs, who again, once the prize was announced, he publicly said in his mind a third prize should have been given to this third author who was independently made the same discovery. So in that sense, the tool can give, so if you run the tool, it can give each author a relative contribution of how much the community sees their contribution to that paper, as well as you can compare authors who work in the same field, which means that they have co-citations, but may have not actually co-authored the paper.
Great. So Laszlo, once more, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I personally, particularly, am looking forward to read this latest paper on hidden citations. I think
yes, we have to put it on archive. We haven't done it, but thanks for the opportunity to show it because we're very excited about that too.
Yes. It's like we are the first insiders into this. So.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much again to the speaker, the host, and everybody who asked questions. And we look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thanks and bye-bye.